full audiobook reading of the magical approach. Seth speaks about the art of creative living, written by Jane Roberts in 1995. Session 1. The rational mind versus the artistic mind. We will, as always, begin in our own way. The natural person is indeed the magical person, and you have both to some extent had very recent examples of such activity. Important misunderstandings involving time have been in a large measure responsible for many of Rupert's difficulties. All of this involves relating to reality in a more natural and therefore magical fact. There is certainly a kind of natural physical time in your experience and in the experience of any creature. It involves the rhythm of the seasons, the days and nights and tides and so forth. In the light of that kind of physical time, which is involved within earthly biology, there is no basic cultural time. That is, to this natural rhythm you have culturally added the idea of clocks, moments and hours and so forth, which you have transposed over nature's rhythms. Such a cultural time works well overall for the civilization that concentrates upon partialities, bits and pieces, assembly lines, promptness of appointments, and so forth. It fits an industrialized society as you understand it. The time that any artistic creator is involved with follows Earth's own time, however. The creator's time rises out of the seasons and the tides, even though in your society you make a great effort to fit the creator's time into what I will call assembly line time. If you are a writer or an artist, then it seems that you must produce so many paintings or books, or whatever, as, say, an automobile worker must process so many pieces of the overall car chassis. Particularly, if you want to make a living at your art, you fall into the frame of mind in which you think that each minute is valuable. But what you mean is that each minute must be a minute of production, but each moment must be valuable in itself, whatever you do with it. Rupert culturally has felt, for many reasons that have been discussed, that each moment must be devoted to work. You have to some extent felt the same. I said that the artistic creator operates in the time of the seasons and so forth, in a kind of natural time, but that natural time is far different than you suppose, far richer, and it turns inward and outward and backward and forward upon itself. Being your own natural and magical self when you dream, you utilize information that is outside of the time context experienced by the so-called rational mind. The creative abilities operate in the same fashion, appearing within consecutive time, but with the main work done outside of it entirely. When you finished your project, you had several days of feeling miserable, but you caught yourself and turned yourself around beautifully, and you have every right to congratulate yourself in that regard. The same thing happened to Rupert, and to some extent, with some individual variations, the same causes were involved. When you were both working on those projects, your cultural time was taken up in a way you found acceptable. Creative time and cultural time to some extent merged, in that you could see daily immediate evidence of creativity's product coming out of the typewriters, say, like any product off an assembly line. You were using time as your cultural training told you to do. When the projects were done, particularly with Rupert, there was still the cultural belief that time should be so used, that creativity must be directed and disciplined to fall into the proper time slots. In other words, to some extent or another, he tried to use an assembly line kind of time for your creative productivity. This may work when manuscripts are being typed and so much physical labor is involved, but overall you are using the wrong approach to time, particularly for any creative artist. This again applies particularly to Rupert, though you are not exonerated in that regard. There is much material here that I will give you, because it is important that you understand the different ways of relating to reality and how those ways create the experienced events. You have not really, either of you, been ready to drastically alter your orientations, but you are approaching that threshold. As Rupert's notes also mention, the magical approach means that you actually change your methods of dealing with problems, achieving goals and satisfying means. You change over to the methods of the natural person. They are indeed, then, a part of your private experience. They are not esoteric methods, but you must be convinced that they are the natural methods by which man is meant to handle his problems and approach his challenges. I use the word methods because you understand it, but actually we are speaking about an approach to life, a magical or natural approach to life that is man's version of the animal's natural instinctive behavior in the universe. That approach does indeed fly in direct contradiction to the learned methods you have been taught. You have held on to those methods to varying degrees, since after all it seems that the world shares them. They are understood ways of dealing with events. Once again, however, with the experience of the last few days, you are both astonished by the magical ease by which work, real work, can be accomplished, events perceived out of place and time and so forth. All of that can be transferred to other areas of your lives, and in particular to Rupert's physical difficulties. I do understand your joint concern, and in holding the session, I know you want specific answers, which I always give to the best of my ability. It certainly seems that the best way to get specific answers is to ask specific questions, and the rational mind thinks first of all of something like a list of questions. In that regard, Rupert's response before such a session is natural, and to an extent magical, because he knows that no matter what he has been taught, he must to some degree forget the questions and the mood that accompanies them with one level of his consciousness in order to create the proper kind of atmosphere at another level of consciousness. An atmosphere that allows the answers to come even though they may be presented in a different way than that expected by the rational mind. What we will be discussing for several sessions with your permission jointly, and I hope with your joint enthusiasm, will be the magical approach to reality and to your private lives specifically, in order to create that kind of atmosphere in which the answers become experienced. Trying to fit the great thrust of creativity into assembly line time is in itself bound to lead to conflicts, dissatisfactions, and frustrations. If the proper creative and magical orientation is kept primarily in mind, other things will fall into place. You do not say to the creative self, "Now, it is 7:30. People are at their assembly lines. I am." Assembly line time does not really value time only as time can be used for definite prescribed purposes. In that framework, to enjoy time becomes a weakness or a vice, and both of you to some extent have so considered time. With creative people strongly gifted, as in your cases, the natural person is very prominent, no matter what you do. It therefore strongly resents any basically meaningless constraints placed about its experience. It knows, for example, how to enjoy each day, how to collect creative insights from each and every encounter, how to enrich itself physically through household chores or other activities. It dislikes being told that it must work thus and so at command of unreasonable restraint. The natural person is anything but irrational. It gathers all of experience together and transforms it. So many of your problems have been caused by applying the wrong kind of orientation to your lives and activities. I say wrong, meaning no moral judgment, but the application of one method to a pursuit that cannot be adequately expressed in such a fashion. The assembly line time and the beliefs that go along with it have given you many benefits as a society, but it should not be forgotten that the entire framework was initially set up to cut down on impulses, creative thought, or any other activities that would lead to anything but the mindless repetition of one act after another. In other words, that entire framework is meant to give you a standardized, mass-produced version of reality. None of its concepts can rationally be applied to creative endeavors. The orientation that gives you the creative achievement lies in the opposite direction. Creativity itself has its own built-in discipline, the kind that, for example, in a dream can rummage through the days of the future to find precisely the data required to make a specific point. All of this material applies to Rupert's condition, and an understanding of it will create the climate in which beneficial results can appear. When Rupert finished his project, he found himself with all of that time that was supposed to be used. He also became aware once again of his limitations. Physically speaking, there was not much, it seemed, he could do but work, so he took the rational approach, and it says that to solve the problem you worry about. At the same time, the natural person did emerge. Rupert followed his impulses and interpreted your dreams, all of which led you both into fresh creative activity. But it was not work. What he needed to do was really relax, not prove that he could or should or must immediately. True creativity comes from enjoying the moments, which then fulfill themselves, and a part of the creative process is indeed the art of relaxation, the letting go, for that triggers magical activity, and that is what Rupert must learn. I will have quite a bit to say, again, about the magical approach. As far as Rupert's present situation, he should not wear, say, one pair of jeans for a week, but instead alternate with 2 or 3 pairs that can be worn, of course, many times. The underclothes are a poor kind, both for the weather and for someone whose motions are restricted. He should also vary his nightwear more. Your suggestion that he walk one more time when he mentioned a program was excellent. It made him realize how limited his activity had become, and again, following the prescribed rational prescription, he worried about it. Then he contrasted his present position against the idealized desired one, all of which served to lower his mood and intensify his susceptibility to the heat, chair pressure, and so forth. I want it understood that we are indeed dealing with 2 entirely different approaches to reality and to solving problems. Methods we will here call the rational method and the magical one. The rational approach works quite well in certain situations, such as mass production of goods or in certain kinds of scientific measurements. But all the rational method, as it is understood and used, does not work as an overall approach to life or in the solving of problems that involve subjective rather than objective measurements or calculations. Those methods work least of all for any art. It is a trite statement, perhaps, but the ruler's measurements have absolutely nothing to do with the measurements made by the heart, and they can never be used to express the incalculable measurements that are made automatically by the smallest cell. The rational mind alone, because it is a rather artificial construct, a function given prominence, can never understand the dream measurements that you undertook in order to come up with the Brenner dream. Rupert kept a strong rational approach to make sure that he was keeping his psychic activity in line, because in your society this seemed the only rational thing to do. Your problems have not been solved. Then, largely, of course, because you have taken the wrong approach, and that is because you were jointly not convinced as yet. You still held to those trained beliefs. In that regard, Rupert has suffered more than you have. The old beliefs, of course, and the rational approach are everywhere reinforced, and so it does indeed have a great weight. The magical approach has far greater weight, if you use it and allow yourselves to operate in that fashion, for it has the weight of your basic natural orientation. The rational approach is the superimposed one. I think that you are both ready to understand that. In this session is material that will indeed allow Rupert to get out of the present situation, but we will continue the discussion at our next session. I have given you some such material before, as I intend to give you shortly. With your own recent experiences, however, the material will be more meaningful and significant now, so that you can indeed put it this time to better use, and I will also be somewhat more specific. I will also go into any questions you want regarding your later dreams or their implication. It is good to be back with you again. End of session, and a fond and magical good evening to you both. Session 2. The Intellect and the Magical Approach. Good evening. It is not that you overuse the intellect as a culture, but that you rely upon it to the exclusion of all other faculties in your approach to life. Period. The intellect is brilliant, but on its own now. It is indeed in its way isolated both in time and in space in a way that other portions of the personality are not. When it is overly stressed with all of the usual frameworks or rationales that go along with it, it can indeed become frightened, paranoid, because it cannot really perceive events until they have already occurred. It does not know what will happen tomorrow, and since it is overly stressed, its paranoid tendencies can only fear the worst. Now those tendencies are not natural to the intellect, but only appear when it is forced to operate in such an isolated fashion, isolated not only in time and space, but psychologically isolated from other portions of the personality that are meant to bring it additional information that it does not possess, and a kind of magical support. The so-called rational approach to life, as it is practiced, is a highly pessimistic one, carrying along with it its own methods and solutions to problems, its own means of achieving ends and satisfying desires. Many people are so steeped in that approach to life that they become psychologically blind to any other kind of orientation. Such is obviously not the case with you and Rupert, or you would not be having this session or any other such activity. The rational approach, of course, suits certain kinds of people better than others, even while it still carries its disadvantages. You have been living in an industrialized, scientific society, so that the benefits and the great disadvantages of the rational approach appear everywhere in the social and political world. Artists of any kind find such an approach the least friendly, for it directly contradicts the vast thrust of man's creativity in several important areas. You, however, and Rupert, do have evidence that hardbed reality is quite different. In the past, you have both felt at some disadvantage yourselves, feeling our work to be theoretically fascinating, creatively valid, but not necessarily containing any statement about any kind of scientifically valid hardbed reality. You did not think you were dealing with fiction. On the other hand, you were not willing to call it fact either. You are, in fact, dealing with a larger version of fact from which, as I have said before, the world of fact emerges. There have been numerous fascinating bits of evidence in your own lives, apart from these sessions, though certainly to some extent stimulated by the knowledge you gain in the sessions. They remain isolated bits, odds and ends, in which case they begin to present you with a larger factual representation of reality. All of this material applies to your lives in general and to Rupert's physical condition, because you must be clear in your minds as to your own status in that regard, and much of this material will clear the air and dissolve lingering doubts, doubts that cause both of you, but Rupert in particular, to hold on to the rational approach in a misguided effort to maintain what he thinks of as a balanced viewpoint and open mind. It seems, because of the definitions you have been taught, that there is only one narrow kind of rationality, and that if you forsake the boundary of that narrow definition, then you become irrational, fanatic, mad, or whatever. The thin, cold rationality that is recognized as such is instead a fake veneer covering a far deeper spontaneous rationality, and it is the existence of that magical rationality that provides the basis for the intellect to begin with. The rationality that you accept is then but one small clue as to the spontaneous inner rationality that is a part of each natural person. In one dream, when you were asleep, when you were seemingly not rational, when your intellect was seemingly not operating, you perceived information about your past physical environment. You saw your old neighborhood, the Brenner's place, with animal and industrial waste. Symbolically, you saw the situation in your own fashion, but you knew that the Brenner's property had been polluted. You still have a love of that area. You are in a certain correspondence with it. In a fashion, you keep your eye out for information regarding it. You are also somewhat idealizing the past, however, so you did not simply get the information straight on, but you received it in such a fashion that it made its own psychological points also, and was furthermore wound into other action not only within that dream, but in a series of dreams. The dream made its point, whether or not you read the article that later appeared. The dream made its point, in fact, whether or not you remembered it, though you did. You remembered it because you wanted to bring into your conscious range instances of your own greater knowing. The portion of you that formed the dream knew of the pollution, but also knew of the award, the newspaper article, and of your habit of reading the evening's paper. All of that involves a psychological motion of natural, magical import. It shows you that the rules of the rational world are filled with holes. It shows you that the rational world's views do not represent the bulwarks of safety, but are instead barriers to the full use of the intellect and of the intuitions. Rupert, having interpreted your dream, looked wide awake but relaxed through his studio into the kitchen. He thought of asking you to take a snapshot of the table with your camera, showing the partially opened front door so that later he could paint the scene. Your camera could not take in all of that, a fact he never thought of. Less than 2 minutes later, you came out into his studio with the camera that you had not used for months. Rupert had also been thinking newly about the magical approach from ideas in your own notes that he had just read. You came out as if in answer, as if to say, yes, the magical approach does indeed operate. Rupert's state of mind was in correspondence with your own state of mind, even as you are in some kind of correspondence with your old environment. So in these cases you have a free flow of information at other level. Now when you understand that intellectually, then the intellect can take it for granted that its own information is not all the information you possess. It can realize that its own knowledge represents the tip of the iceberg. As you apply that realization to your life, you begin to realize furthermore that in practical terms you are indeed supported by a greater body of knowledge than you consciously realize, and by the magical, spontaneous fountain of action that forms your existence. The intellect can then realize that it does not have to go it all alone. Everything does not have to be reasoned out, even to be understood. This information is factual. I am not saying that I do not use analogies often, or that I am not forced at times into symbolic statements, but when I am, I always say so, And even those statements are my best representations of facts too large for your definitions. The intellect, then, can and does form strong paranoid tendencies when it is put in the position of believing that it must solve all personal problems alone, or nearly, and certainly when it is presented with any picture of worldwide predicaments. The rational approach, built up around this framework, insists that the best way to solve a problem is to concentrate upon it, to project its effects into the future, to ruminate upon its consequences, to stare at the bare facts head-on. This brings about an atmosphere in which the problem is compounded. The intellect on its own, so it seems, must deal not only with the problem today, but with its effects in the projected disastrous tomorrows. This well-intentioned concentration, this determination to solve the problem, this rational approach, then causes an even deeper sense of inadequacy. The concentration upon the problem brings about a kind of mechanical repetition, a repeated type of hip. The intellect is a great organizer along certain lines now. So if this concentration is continued, it begins to organize its perceptions and experience along the same lines. It is a kind of misguided attempt to find order by finding data that agrees with itself. It collects evidence then to prove its point, because the rational mind, as you understand it, must have an acceptable reason for everything. In the meantime, of course, quite valid rock evidence that does not fit into the picture gradually becomes discarded, ignored, thrown away. It is there, but it is not used. It disappears as evidence, becomes inactive. That method of problem-solving, need I say, is a poor one, and if anything, it causes far more problems than it ever solves. In terms of Rupert's condition, he often thinks that he is faced with the evidence that his condition is not improving, that it is growing worse, that all the evidence says such conditions do deteriorate rather than improve. He sometimes thinks that he is being realistic with such thoughts. What happens, of course, is the process I have just outlined. Other quite real, quite physical evidence, always, now apparent in his body at any given time, is ignored as non-essential, too trivial to bother with or take seriously, because it does not fit into the so-called rational picture that has been developed. The process is exactly as given in the paragraph above, so I want that understood. Any improvement, unless stated, is almost overlooked, not considered as much hard evidence, while any difficulties definitely are considered hard evidence because they fit into the overall data-collecting intellect. As stated above, they are significant, while the improvements do not seem to be nearly as much so. Rupert has had some release in the past week of the jaw, neck, and shoulder areas. His eyes at times, on 3 or 4 occasions, read remarkably better. For some time, his ankles and knees have had greater freedom of motion in certain motions, but all such evidence is ignored largely, or worse, it is viewed ironically, since he is not walking any better. You picked up the information about the Brenners because you were in correspondence with that environment. You picked up inner evidence in that regard. You ignored countless other bits of information. Rupert picked up your own camera activities because he was in correspondence with you. He must be in correspondence with the evidence of mobility that his body tries to give him so that it can build up a new picture of his body. You change your focus point. You change what you consider significant. This session brings us to the beginning of a discussion of the magical approach to life, to the solving of problems. I hope to stress what to do rather than what not to do, although at times I must make the distinction clear. If you understand this session thoroughly, and if you have the intent to really change your orientation, then the atmosphere will automatically be created in which desired changes occur. End of session, Session 3. Definition of the magical approach. Good evening. I myself have heard it said that all other species preserve nature, while man has a propensity for destruction. I have myself heard it said that other creatures behave with a natural grace, save man. I have myself heard it said that all of nature is content unto itself save man, who is filled with discontent. Such thoughts follow naturally the dictums of so. When you think such thoughts, you think of them at the most strained level of intellectual speculation. That is, the thought seems self-evident to the intellect that is forced to operate by itself, relatively speaking, divorced from the self's other faculties. It then does indeed seem that man is somehow apart from nature, or worse, an ungrateful blight, almost a parasite, upon the face of the planet. That view itself is a symptom of the intellect's difficulty. in the position in which your culture places the intellect, it does see itself quite alone, separated both from other portions of the personality, from other creatures, and from nature itself. Therefore, science, for example, says that creatures, except for man, operate by blind instinct, and that term is meant to explain all of the complicated behavior of the other species. Therefore, the gulf between man and animals, the intellect and nature, seems to deepen. In those terms, it is quite as truthful to say, as I have said before, that man's intellect is also instinctive. He begins thinking at once. He cannot help but use his intellect. The intellect, again, operates magically, spontaneously. Its most keen reasoning processes rise as a result of that natural magical action. The intellect has been taught to divorce itself from its source. It realizes in that regard a sense of powerlessness, for to some extent it is philosophically cut off from its own source of power. When it looks, therefore, at the world of political events, the problems seem insoluble. Man makes many decisions that may seem quite wrong to the intellect because of its belief systems, and because it is so cut off from other sources of information. A goodly number of those mistaken decisions, or poor moves, often represent self-corrective actions, decisions taken on knowledge not consciously perceived, but this escapes your consciousness. In the same way, some private life decisions or events may appear disadvantageous to the intellect for the same reasons, while instead they are also self-corrective measures that you are not able to perceive because of your beliefs. The rational approach, as it is now used, carries a basic assumption that anything that is wrong will get worse. That belief, of course, is highly detrimental because it runs against the basic principles of life. Were this the case in your terms of history, the world would never have lasted a century. It is interesting to note that even before medical science, there were a goodly number of healthy populations. No disease rubbed out the entire species. When you believe that the worst will happen, you must always be on guard. In your culture, people use the term intellect almost like a weapon to protect themselves against impending disaster. They must be alert for dangers of all kinds. They begin to collect evidence of danger so that any other kind of orientation to life seems foolhardy, and to be a realist means in that framework to look out for the worst. First of all, if you realize that the intellect itself is a part of nature, a part of the natural person, a part of magical processes, then you need not overstrain it, force it to feel isolated, or put it in a position in which paranoid tendencies develop. It is itself supported, as your intuitions are, by life's magical processes. It is supported by the greater energy that gave you and the world birth. That power is working in the world, and in the world of politics, as it is in the world of nature, since you make that distinction. When you follow that so-called rational approach, however, you are bound to feel threatened, divorced from your body. Your thoughts and your body seem separate. Divisions seem to appear between the mental and the physical, where again each are supported by those magical processes. The rational approach goes against what I can only call life's directives and life's natural rhythms. It is contradictory to biological integrity, and again it does not make sense. That rational approach is, of course, connected now with scientific ideas mentioned earlier. Life surrounded by chaos, the struggle for survival, and so forth. I do not mean to put down the intellect. It is highly important, but it is, if you will forgive me, as natural as a cat's whiskers. It is not some adjunct to nature, but a part of it. The magical approach takes it for granted, in the simplest terms, that the life of any individual will fulfill itself, will develop and mature, that the environment and the individual are uniquely suited and work together. This sounds very simple. In verbal terms, however, those are the beliefs, if you will, of each cell. They are imprinted in each chromosome, in each atom. They provide a built-in faith that pervades each living creature, each snail, each hair on your head. Those ingrained beliefs are, of course, biologically pertinent, providing the impetus of all growth and development. Each cell believes in a better tomorrow. I am, I admit, personifying our cell here, but the statement has a firm truth. Furthermore, each cell contains within itself a belief and an understanding of its own inevitability. It knows it lives beyond its death. In other words, the idea of heaven, for all of its distortions, has operated as a theoretical framework assuring the intellect of its survival. Science has believed to the contrary in the utter annihilation of the intellect after death. And since man had by then placed all of his identification with the intellect, this was a shattering blow to it. It denied man a necessary biological imperative. All of these reasons lie beneath man's mass problems and apply in each life. I want to note, again, that Rupert earlier decided to bank on his intellect as a child rather than upon beauty, as he felt his mother. In his case also, as given in the past, he felt that the feminine qualities were those opposed to intellectual development. He was gifted intuitively and intellectually, however, and naturally was propelled toward growth in both areas that he felt stressed contradictory rather than complementary characteristics. Now take any other person, or rather more to the point, any other woman, in the so-called psychic field. Rupert tries to prove that he is reasonable, rational, where such people, he feels, have never learned to use their powers of reason and instead trust every stray thought that comes into their heads. So to doubt himself was protective. He also felt that the questioning power of the intellect was not just one of its functions, which it is, but its primary purpose, which it is not. In your terms, the intellect's primary function is to make clear deductions and distinctions involving the personality's relationship with the world. Your society, however, has indeed considered the rational approach to be the masculine-favored one, so Rupert had an additional reason in that regard to be such a proponent of the rational approach. All of the beliefs connected with the sex were of course erroneous, but they were part and parcel of that rational framework itself. It is certainly too simple to say what I'm going to say, yet it is almost as if you would be better off turning the entire rational approach upside down, taking it for granted that all of its assumptions were false, for they are indeed more false than true. Again, you see, the divisions are arbitrary on your part. The intellect is, again, the result of highly spontaneous processes of which it itself knows nothing, and the intuitions that are considered so undisciplined and unreasonable are based upon calculations far more spectacular than those of which the conscious mind can conceive. The intellect could not follow them, so the distinctions are not basic. They are the result of beliefs and habitual usage. Therefore, of course, I speak of them separately, as you think of them. The magical approach takes it for granted that the human being is a united creature, fulfilling purposes in nature, even as the animals do, whether or not those purposes are understood. The magical approach takes it for granted that each individual has a future, a fulfilling one, even though death may be tomorrow. The magical approach takes it for granted that the means for development are within each individual, and that fulfillment will happen now. Overall, that approach operates in your world. If it did not, there would be no world. If the worst was bound to happen, as the scientists certainly think, even evolution, in their terms, would have been impossible. Of course, a nice point to put somewhere. You needed this background, for I want to build up the atmosphere in which this magical approach can be comprehended. Then specific material. In your dream you were, of course, in the process of forming new ideas about the nature of the magical self, and also in your way working that idea out through imagery. The dream is above all example of work being done at other levels of awareness. Rupert's mental conversation with Mary, and your own dream about Mary with the sketchbook sheets. All of these experiences are indications of the exquisite kind of reasoning that goes on at the levels of awareness that are usually considered unreasonable. That kind of material enriches the intellect and reassures it. Do have Rupert tell you how he is doing mood-wise. For now, you can help him there. He must realize that relaxation is also a part of the creative process. Left alone, he would do the right thing. We will continue this discussion at our next session, and in the meantime, be on the lookout for other hints and clues that will bring you a better idea of the magical approach. End of session. Session 4. Science and Science's Picture, Desire as Action. Good evening. I want to begin by mentioning one of the most important and vital messages in your glass door dream, for its truth applies to the magical approach as well. That is, the dream was giving you an example of one of the main characteristics of what we will call the magical approach. Rupert did not stress this in his interpretation, which was otherwise excellent. The main issue was the relative ease with which you were able to enlarge the hole in the glass door. Ease is the key word. To the world of the intellect, a glass door must be considered solid, as it is in the world of physical senses. In other quite as factual terms, indeed in the larger framework of facts, the door, of course, is not solid at all, as no objects are. Obviously, that is known to science. Science delegates the world of nature as the realm of exterior natural events. Its view of nature is therefore mechanistic. The natural self, however, like the rest of nature, possesses a rich dimension of inside psychological depth that science, because of its own definitions, cannot perceive. Telepathy and clairvoyance, for example, are a part of natural effects, but they belong to a nature so much more expansive than science's definitions that they have been made to appear as highly unnatural eccentricities of behavior rather than as natural components of consciousness. It is also for that reason that they seem to fall outside of the realm of the sane. Such characteristics are, however, basic properties of the natural person. They do not appear very well under the auspices of the scientific method, because the scientific method is itself programmed to perceive only information that fits into its preconceived pattern. Such abilities appear to be unpredictable, discontinuous, only because you are so relatively unaware of what is actually quite constant psychological behavior. That is, such abilities operate so smoothly, so continuously, and with such ease that you become aware of them only under certain conditions. You are aware of what seem to be isolated hints of odd characteristics. The intellect is basically able to handle many kinds of information and information systems. It is far more flexible than you presently allow it to be. It can handle several main world views at once, realizing that they are each methods of perceiving and, to some degree, historically speaking, that sort of situation operated in the past when, comparatively speaking, now, people realized that there was indeed an inner world of complexity and richness that could be approached in certain fashions, one that existed alongside with the physical world so that the two intersected. Certain approaches worked in one area and others worked in the inner reality. The intellect could handle both approaches, operating with separate assumptions. There were separate assumptions that applied to different realities. I do not mean to idealize those times. In so-called modern ages, however, the intellect has been stripped down, so to speak. Science perceived the spectacular complexity of exterior reality, but turned its sights completely away from any recognition, any at all, until it regarded subjectivity itself as a mere throwaway product, accidentally formed by a mindless. All of this applies to your situation, for I want you to thoroughly understand, intellectually and emotionally, the errors of current thought, so that you can see that our material is indeed providing you not only with creative material, but with a more factual presentation of the framework in which you have your existence. In modern times, then, the intellect was finally left with only one acceptable worldview, with one set of assumptions, with only one main approach to reality and experience. The acceptable assumptions, to a large extent, ran directly contradictory to built-in biological, spiritual, and psychological assumptions that are a part of man's heritage. The intellect does try to order experience, to make sense out of perception, when it is enriched by having in its possession several worldviews. Then it does an excellent job of merging those into meaningful patterns, of sorting information and sending it to the proper places, so to speak. It understands, for example, that clairvoyant material is a part of the personality's overall characteristics, so it is not afraid of perceiving it, and it is able to separate such information confusion from present physical sense perception. Orderliness, then, is one of its main characteristics. When it is given only one worldview and only one group of assumptions, its orderly nature causes it to throw out all information that does not fit. It is almost forced to make an orderly picture, say like a jigsaw puzzle picture, while being denied half of the pieces. The intellect is not to blame. It does the best it can under those conditions. Now in your dream, you are quite clearly seeing the threshold between physical reality and the magical dimension in which that physical reality has its source. You are being shown, or showing yourself, the difference in the rules or assumptions between the two. The dog's desire for food led him to walk magically through the door, for the desires of the natural creature are satisfied with an ease that has nothing to do with your ideas of work. What I am getting at is the introduction of the concepts of a different kind of work, very valuable, vital work that is performed at another level and in a different fashion. A prime example, of course, is the work done to keep each and every creature alive and breathing, the work done to keep the planets in their places, the work being done so that one evolutionist can meditate over his theories. Now in your dream, you got the feeling of that kind of work or action. It is the given power of the world, the given power of nature. It is the directed force of value fulfillment. In other terms, it is of course the energy of all that is. The trouble is that the rational view of life has separated man from a sense of his own power source. When he has a problem, the rational approach to its solution seems the only answer, and often, of course, it is no answer at all. Rupert wanted to make sure that he was right. He tried to go ahead and not go ahead at the same time. He tried to be daring and cautious, brave and safe. This applies to some extent to each of you, of course, precisely because you were gifted strongly both intellectually and intuitively. You tried to rationalize your creativity, both of you, to some extent. The rational line of thought finds creativity highly disruptive. So in those terms, as highly gifted creative people, you would have encountered some difficulties in any case. It is time that you regarded such difficulties instead as challenges that are a part of a creative adventure that you have yourselves chosen. You chose the adventure because it was the kind best suited to your own individual value fulfillment. In reconciling the many concepts and contradictions for yourselves, you also lead the way for many others. It would, again, help considerably if you thought of your work more as an adventure, an exciting creative adventure, than of work in your old terms. This will allow you to include the feeling of inner, magical work into your calculations. It would also begin to give you a feeling for the magical support that upholds you both and your lives, the support that Rupert can count upon, and that can bring about the solution to his physical difficulties. Here again, the vital word is ease or effortlessness. If you want to feed a dog in the physical world, and he is on the other side of the door, you must open it. In the inner world, you or the dog can walk through the door without effort, because desire is action. In the inner world, your desires bring about their own fulfillment effortlessly. That inner world and the exterior one intersect and interweave. They only appear separate. In the physical world, time may have to elapse or whatever, conditions may have to change or whatever, but the desire would bring about the proper results. The feeling of effortlessness is what is important. It is quite proper for Rupert's intellect to understand this and to say simply now, that is not my realm. I will leave the solution to that problem where it belongs. We will use the magical approach here. Rupert feels hopeless at times because the assumptions of the rational approach often lead in that direction, and because he has not been certain enough of himself in those other areas to get the kind of long-lasting results he wants. This applies to both of your attitudes at times. At a conscious level, of course, neither of you realized or wanted to realize the kind of complete repeal and overhaul that was implied by our sessions, and for some years you managed to hold many official views of reality along with the newer concepts, not ready to understand that an entire new way of thinking was involved, a new relationship of the individual with reality. So you tried out some new methods piecemeal, here and there, with good enough results. Of course, an entire reorientation is instead implied, and that entire reorientation will effortlessly bring about a new relationship of Rupert with his body, with his life, and with the adventure the two of you have embarked upon. He will simply automatically get better because the framework will allow him to do so. A few mundane but helpful notes. He must, of course, be allowed some uninterrupted writing time. Neither of you understand your attitudes toward the bedroom. Both of you avoid making love in it. It is the one room that is not a part of your overall activities. It seems isolated from your lives. You do not fix it up, for example. This is partially the result of old ideas, where sleep is a separate, isolated part of life or of the personality. You would both feel better in it if it showed more of your other interests. For Rupert, some books or bookcases. It is a room that shows no evidence of his work, you see. It should hold some of your current paintings, but in some way it should be tied in with your lives more. Ideally, a new bed would be advantageous, both physically and symbolically. Relaxation, laying down for example, would be far more easily assimilated on Rupert's part. Also, if a cot or equivalent, a daybed or whatever, were a part of his writing room or in the breezeway. You enjoy the living room for a nap because of its sensual reaches. Your metabolisms are different, quite naturally, and under the usual situations, given your lunch hour, Rupert needs a good meal, sometimes certainly between 5 and 6 at the latest. Otherwise he experiences a natural physical irritation that is complicated then by other issues. You need your painting time, as you have discovered. He enjoys the twilight hour in his writing room, and though the seasons have something to do with that, still it is a good idea when possible. Your own reassurances are very helpful, and remember that they operate on other than physical terms. Now I bid you a fond good evening. Session 5. Combining the magical approach and the so-called rational approach. Good evening. A continuation of our discussion. The scientific framework of reference has become equated with the term rational thinking, to such an extent that any other slant of thought automatically seems to be irrational. Thought has become, in that regard, too specialized, prejudiced, and Now there are styles of thought. Each individual has his or her own style of thinking, a peculiar, rich, individual mixture of speculations, fantasies, idiocentric ways of using subjective and objective data. Science has so dominated the world of thought, however, that many nuances and areas once considered quite rational have become quite unrespectable. Science tries to stick to what it can prove. Unfortunately, it tends to set up a worldview that is then based upon certain material, biology, psychology, physics, mathematics, and so forth, each with its own group of facts, jealously guarded, each providing its own worldview. The world as seen through biology, or reality as seen through the eyes of physics. There is no separate field that combines all of that information or applies the facts of one discipline to the facts of another discipline. So overall, science, with its brand of rational thought, can offer no even, suggestive, hypothetical, comprehensive ideas of what reality is. It seems that each individual is in effect isolated in certain vital regards, given, say, a genetic heritage and a certain amount of unspecified energy with which to run the body's machinery. Intent, purpose, or desire do not apply in that picture. The individual is, again, a stranger, almost an alien, in his or her own environment, in which he must struggle to survive, not only against the uncaring forces of the immediate environment, but against the genetic determinism. He must fight against his own body, overemphasize its susceptibility to built-in defects, diseases, and against a built-in time bomb, so to speak, when without warning extinction will arrive. Science does not stress the cooperative forces of nature. It glories in distinctions, specifications, and categories, and is quite blind, generally speaking, to the uniting forces that are of course every bit as real. Therefore, when I speak of the natural person being also the magical person, it is easy to transpose even that idea into more isolated terms than I intend. It is not just that each person has his or her source in a magical dimension from which his or her overall life emerges, but that the private source itself is a part of the very energy that upholds the entire planet and its inhabitants, and the overall construct that you understand as the universe. Fields of interrelatedness connect all kinds of life, supporting it not through, say, just one system, a biological one or a spiritual one, but at every conceivable point of its existence. You are not just given so much energy. In those terms earlier mentioned, new energy is everywhere available. Again, there are no closed systems. Again, the environment is conscious and alive. There are constant communications between all portions of your body and all portions of the environment. In your terms, this means that you do not have to rely upon what you think of as your private resources. Basically, value fulfillment is one of the most important characteristics of existence, so that all things act individually and together in ways that best provide for the overall fulfillment of the entire construct. You were born because you desired to be born. A plant comes to life for the same reason. You live in a different frame of reference than a plant, however. You have more choices available. You interact with nature differently. Your intellect is meant to help you make choices. It allows you to perceive certain probabilities within a physical time context. You use the intellect properly when it is allowed to perceive physical conditions as clearly as possible. Then it can make the most beneficial decisions as to what goals you want to achieve. Those goals are usually conceptualized desires, and once formed they act in a fashion like magnets, drawing from those vast fields of interrelatedness the kinds of conditions best suited to their fulfillment. The intellect alone cannot bring about the fulfillment of those goals. The intellect alone cannot bring about one motion of the body. It must count upon those other properties that it does indeed set into motion, that spontaneous array of inner complexity, that ordered period. When the intellect is used properly, it thinks of a goal and automatically sets the body in motion toward it, and automatically arouses the other levels of communication unknown to it, so that all forces work together toward the achievement. Consider a hypothetical goal as a target. When properly used, the intellect imagines the target and imaginatively then attains it. If it were a physical target, the person would stand bow and arrow in hand, thinking only of hitting the bull's eye, mentally concentrating upon it, making perhaps some learned gestures, proper footing or whatever, and the body's magical properties would do the rest. When the intellect is improperly used, however, it is as if the intellect feels required to somehow know or personally direct all of those inner processes. When the erroneous belief systems and negativity connected with so-called rational reason apply, then it is as if our person sees the target, but instead of directing his attention to it, he concentrates upon all of the different ways that his arrow could go wrong. It could fall to the left or the right, go too far or not far enough, break in the air, fall from his hand, or in multitudinous other ways betray his intent. He has switched his attention from the target, of course, completely. He has projected upon the present event the picture of his fears rather than the picture of his original intent. His body, responding to his mental images and his thoughts, brings out actions that mirror his confusion. In other words, the magical approach and the so-called rational one are to be combined in a certain fashion for best results. People sometimes write you telling of their intent to make money, or rather to have it. They concentrate upon money, so they say, and wait for it in full faith that it will be attracted to them because of their belief and concentration. They might do the point of power exercise, for example. They may also, however, have quit their jobs, ignored impulses to find other work, or to take any rational approaches and rely upon, say, the magical approach alone. This does not work either, of course. As Rupert uses the magical approach, and as you use it, you will see that it blends in perfectly with the rest of existence, inspires the intellect, inspires physical motion, for it activates physical properties. I will continue describing the ways in which the two approaches work together. The main point I want to make is, however, the fact that your private source of power is a portion of that greater field of interrelatedness in which your being is securely couched. It is not something you have to strain after. It was effortlessly yours at birth and before, and it carries with it its own emotional and intuitive comprehensions that can indeed support you throughout all of your physical existence. If you understand that, then in a large manner, many of your fears will jointly vanish. Elaboration does not seem necessary. You can have it if you want. Tam wanted illustrations for a first book. When he read of George's sketches, he instantly thought of illustrations. Sue, of course, wanted to do George a favor to make up for old issues. There were other probabilities according to George's situation, so that the affair at least opened up the idea that George could do other work for Prentice if he needed money. This gave him a sense of reassurance. That is all for this evening. I bid you a magical good evening again, and remember to look for hints and clues at all levels of your existence. Session 6. Animals and Reasoning. Things Beyond One's Control. Good evening. Part of the difficulty arises from the current scientifically oriented blend of rationalism. It lies in the way in which the individual is defined. As a species, you think of yourselves as the pinnacle of an evolutionary scale, as if all other entities from the first cell onward somehow existed in a steady line of progression, culminating with animals, and finally with man, the reasoning animal. That particular blend of rational thinking with which your society is familiar takes it more or less for granted. Then, that man's identity as a species, and the identity of the individual, is first and foremost connected with the intellect. You identify yourselves with your intellect primarily, casting aside as much as possible other equally vital elements of your personhood. In your historical past, when man identified his identity with the soul, he actually gave himself greater leeway in terms of psychological mobility. But eventually, the concept of the soul as held resulted in a distrust of the intellect. That result was the inevitable follow-up of dogma. Period. Part of man's latest over-identification with the intellect is, of course, an overreaction to those past historical events. Neither religion or science grant other creatures much subjective dimension, however. You like to think of yourselves, again, as the reasoning animal in terms of your species. However, animals do reason. They do not reason in the same areas that you do intently. In those areas in which they do reason, They understand cause and effect quite well. Their reasoning is applied, however, to levels of activity to which your own reasoning is not. Therefore, often animal reasoning is not apparent to you. Animals are curious. Their curiosity is applied to areas in which you seldom apply your own. The animals possess a consciousness of self, and without the human intellect, you do not need a human intellect to be aware of your own consciousness. Animals, it is true, do not reflect upon the nature of their own identities as man does, but this is because that nature is intuitively comprehended. It is self-evident. I only want to show you that the sense of identity need not inevitably be coupled with the intellect exclusively. Your intellect is a part of you, a vital, functioning portion of your cognitive processes, but it does not contain your identity. The natural person is understood perhaps more clearly by considering any person as a child. In a fashion, the child discovers its own intellect as it discovers its own feelings. The child's feelings give rise to curiosity, to thoughts, to the operation of the intellect. Why do I feel thus and so? Why is grass soft and rock hard? Why does a gentle touch soothe me while a slap hurts me? The feelings and sensations give rise to the questions, to the thoughts, to the intellect. The child in a fashion feels its own thoughts rise from a relative psychological invisibility into immediate, vital formation. There is a process there that you have forgotten. The child identifies with its own psychic reality first of all, then discovers its feelings, and claims those, and discovers its thoughts and intellect, and claims those. The child first explores the components of its psychological environment, the inside stuff of subjective knowledge, and claims that inner territory, but the child does not identify its basic being with either its feelings or its thoughts. That is why, for example, it often seems that young children can die so easily. They can disentangle themselves because they have not as yet identified their basic beings with life experience. Period. In most cases, children grow up, of course, although in the vast overall picture of nature, a goodly proportion of individuals do indeed take other courses. They serve other functions. They have other purposes. They take part in life through a different cast of. They affect life while themselves not completely immersed in it. They die young. They are aborted. They remain, however, an important element in life's overall picture, part of a psychological underpainting that always affects later versions. Ideally, however, children finally claim their feelings and their thoughts as their own. They identify naturally with both, finding each valid and vital. By the time you are an adult, however, you have been taught to disconnect your identity from your feelings as much as possible and to think of your personhood in terms of your intellectual orientation. Your identity seems to be in your head. Your feelings and your mental activity therefore appear, often, quite contradictory. You try to solve all problems through the use of reasoning alone. You are taught to submerge the very intuitive abilities that the intellect needs to do its proper work, for the intellect must check with the feeling portions of the self for feedback, for support, for knowledge as to biological conditions. Denied that feedback, it can spin on endlessly in frenzied dry runs. At each moment, from the most microscopic levels, the body in one way or another is ascertaining a constant picture of its position within physical reality. That picture is composed of millions of ever-changing smaller snapshots, as it were, or moving pictures is better, determining so many conditions, positions and relationships that they could never be described. You end up with a predominating picture of reality in any given moment, one that is the result of the activity of psychological, biological, and electromagnetic stratas. One picture is transposed upon the others and calculations made constantly, so that all of the components that make up physical existence are met and intersect to give you life. None of that is the intellect's concern at an intellectual level. At a biological level and at an electromagnetic level, the intellect, of course, performs feats that it cannot consciously know through the use of its reason spontaneously. With the process just mentioned, millions of pictures are being taken also of the probable actions that will be needed, in your terms, in the moment immediately following, from microscopic action to the motion of a muscle, the driving of a car, the reading of a book, or what. One of the intellect's main purposes is to give you a conscious choice in a world of probabilities. To do that properly, the intellect is to make clear, concise decisions on its level of matters that are its concern, and therefore to present its own picture of reality to add to the entire construct. On the one hand, you have been told to identify yourselves almost completely with your intellects. On the other hand, you have been taught that the intellect, the flower of consciousness, is a frail, vulnerable adjunct. Again, a chance creation without meaning and without support. Without support because you believe that beneath it lie primitive, animalistic, bloody instincts against which reason must exert what strength it has. Despite all of that, men and women still find the solutions to many of their problems by rediscovering the larger sense of identity, a sense of identity that accepts the intuitions and the feelings, the dreams and the magic hopes as vital characteristics, not adjuncts of personhood. When I tell you to remember your own natural persons, I do then want to remind you not to identify with your intellects alone, but to enlarge your scopes of identity. Automatically those other, often shunted aside characteristics begin to add their richness, fulfillment, and vitality to your lives effortlessly. The new orientation is bringing results, and the results do appear effortlessly. The affair with Mitzi did involve action at other levels, a magical orientation. Rupert is doing well. Have him remember that creative activity goes on within him all of the time, and he is often most active precisely when he is not aware of it. He is only aware of those moments when creative activity surges into his conscious awareness, and by then much of the work has already been done. He is not responsible for other people's realities, but he is responsible for his own. The ill woman's reality does not threaten his own in any way. The situation, however, shows that he sometimes still thinks he should be able to solve all problems and to know all the reasons for any given sorrow or tragedy. The intellect cannot handle that kind of information at that level. Some answers come when you are ready for them. Then they come naturally as a matter of understanding and comprehension. The question of life's tragedies still cannot be answered satisfactorily at the level at which either of you or anyone else is currently asking it. I can give hints and clues and explanations that are quite valid within that context. As a matter of fact, the kind of literal answers that you may think you want can indeed lead you somewhat astray in terms of the larger picture. So Rupert must say, "That is not my province. Send energy, a note now and then." But the particular problem, the specific problem, is the woman's, not Rupert's. The reason for the problem is a philosophical concern of Rupert's and of yours, but it is one whose answer, or answers, will gradually unfold. All of this information I consider necessary, again, to provide an overall atmosphere of comprehension that will allow the release of your own vitalities and strengths in an effortless manner, in such a way that your own problems begin to dissolve. The kind of orientation I am speaking of represents the truest picture I can give you of man's natural relationship with himself and the world. This is how it works. This is physical. End of session. And again, a magical good evening. Session 7. Creating one's own experience. Good evening. The intellect is far more socially oriented than is generally understood. Some of this, again, is difficult to explain, but in a fashion, the intellect is a cultural phenomenon. It is amazingly resilient, in that according to the belief structures of any given historical period, it can orient itself along the lines of those beliefs, using all of its reasoning abilities to bring such a world picture into focus, collecting data that agree, and rejecting what does not. Obviously, the mind can use its reasoning abilities, for example, to come to the conclusion that there is a single God behind the functioning of the world, that there are many gods, that divinity is a fantasy, and that the world itself springs from no reasonable source. Like statistics, the reasoning abilities can be used to come to almost any conclusion. This is done, again, by taking into consideration, within any given system of reasoning, only the evidence that agrees with the system's premises. This flexibility allows the species great variation overall in its psychological and cultural and political and religious activities. When any system of reasoning becomes too rigid, however, there are always adjustments made that will allow other information to intrude. Otherwise, of course, your belief systems would never change. Your species shares with the other species a feeling of kinship for its kind. There is a great give and take of ideas. You end up, then, with a consensus, generally speaking, as to what a reasonable picture of agreed upon reality is. Your system has frowned upon many experiences, considering them eccentric behavior in an adverse fashion, since your belief systems have so regimented behavior and so narrowly defined sanity. The intellect, I want to stress, is socially oriented. It is peculiarly suited, of course, to react to cultural information. It wants to see the world as it is seen by the minds of others. Through that kind of action, it helps form your cultural environment, the civilization of which you are justly proud. The intellect, then, helps your species translate its own natural purposes and intents, the purposes and intents of the natural person, into their proper cultural context, so that those abilities the natural person possesses can benefit the civilization of those purposes and intents literally change the world. The intellect's expectations and intents spontaneously and automatically trigger the proper bodily mechanisms to bring about the necessary environmental interactions, and your intent, as expressed through your intellect, directs your experience of the world. I am speaking about the intellect here for our discussion, but remember it is everywhere cushioned also. There are backup systems. In other words, if the intellect believes that the world is a threat to existence, then that belief will alter its intents, of course, and therefore the body's activities. The beliefs of the intellect operate then as powerful suggestions, particularly when the intellect identifies with those beliefs, so that there is little distance between the intellect and the beliefs that it holds as true. I am doing my best to explain the very practical aspects of the intellect's beliefs and their strength in drawing experience to you. At one time, you both had difficulty with understanding some of these ideas. Your own relationship, your private beliefs about the sort of persons you wanted individually for mates brought about incalculable actions that led finally to your meeting. Yet it all happened quite naturally, of course. Your beliefs bring you into correspondence with the elements likely to lead to their affirmation. They elicit from other people behavior that is in keeping with those beliefs. Your own attitudes, for example, and beliefs about foreigners' Prentice Hall, people's stupidity and lack of integrity, put you in correspondence with those same beliefs on the part of others, resulting in the translation fiasco. An entirely different kind of behavior could have been elicited from those same people. Like attracts like in that regard, those same people, for example, all have, as you do, beliefs in people's trustworthiness and so forth. But under those conditions, at that time, you each, or rather you all, were in correspondence at many levels. The books were published. They have helped many people, and that is because you were also in correspondence as far as many of your more positive beliefs are concerned, and those did outweigh the others. You get what you concentrate upon, and your beliefs are largely responsible for those areas in which you There are no magical methods, only natural ones that you use all of the time, although in some cases you use them for beliefs that you take for truths, when instead they are quite defective assumptions. A small example, one, incidentally, that Rupert finally realized. But it is a beautiful instance of natural methods. He used it beautifully, even though the results were not pleasing at first. It also shows Rupert's growing understanding. He heard tomorrow's weather report, groaned, thought of a very uncomfortable 90-degree temperature tomorrow, and imagined himself miserable with the heat. Indeed, he began to feel warmer. In a flash, he remembered previous days of discomfort, and in the next moment he projected those into the weekend. He felt trapped. Midway through this process, he tried to catch himself, but he believed that his body could not handle the heat, and that belief outweighed his intent to change his thoughts, so they kept returning for perhaps 10 minutes. He continued, however, to remind himself that he was not going to worry about tomorrow today, regardless. He told himself that the prediction might be wrong, and he began with his intellect to pile up evidence that could in one way or another bring about a different, more beneficial experience. He did this by recognizing the way he had earlier been building up the picture in the old manner by collecting all the evidence that fitted it. He used the same process, only for a more beneficial picture, and the process worked. You have only to become aware of it. Your experience will follow your concentration and belief and expectation. The mind is a great discriminator. It can use its reasoning to bring about almost any possible experience within your framework. Rupert's body is definitely recovering normal motion. Laying down is excellent. The additional moving about, however, from one place to another is most beneficial. The sensations in his buttocks of heat, even burning at times, and in the legs and feet, all represent additional motion and beneficial activity. Sometimes at night, the activity might make him feel uncomfortable, but the body is activating itself in certain ways while have him write a poem a day and do an ink sketch. The thought came to him. It is a good one, while mind and body both relax. I am not an artist, but I know what I like as much as anyone else does. These changes in Rupert's body are as magical as any precognitive dream in that regard. A fond good evening. Session 8. Nature as man's caretaker. Natural magical reasoning and trust. Good evening. Man likes to think of himself as the caretaker of nature and the world. It is closer to the truth, however, to say, in that regard at least, that nature is man's caretaker, or that man exists, physically speaking, as the result of the graceful support of nature and all of its other species. Without those other species, man as you know him would not exist, not without the continuous cooperation of those species with each other and their interrelationships with the environment. Man serves his purposes within nature, as all species do, and in the terms of your understanding, man thinks in his own way, but he is also the thinking portion of nature. He is the portion that thinks, in your understanding, again, of that term. Give us a moment. He deals with the effect of thinking upon nature, so to speak. He adds to the rest of nature. He therefore adds a different kind of mental organization, an organization, then, that nature itself requires, anticipates, and desires. Animals do not read or write books, but they do read nature directly through the context of their own experience and through intuitive knowing. Man's reasoning mind adds an atmosphere to nature that is as real, say, as the Van Allen belts that surround the Earth. The thinking mind, to a large degree, directs the activity of great spontaneous forces, with energy cellular organization being, say, the captain of the body's great energy sources. The reasoning mind defines, makes judgments, deals with the physical objects of the world, and also with the cultural interpretations current in its time. Think of your own government in ideal terms for a moment. Its citizens are all individuals with their own lives and interests. The government, if it has their loyalty, utilizes their energies in such a fashion that the majority are benefited, as is the government itself. Yet you cannot really put your finger on the government, though you might mention the White House as the seat of its power. The government is composed of many people, of course, and really extends all the way down the line, even to its least citizen. But the government can direct the use of energies, of goods, commerce, power, and so forth. The people count upon the government to realistically define the conditions of the world, to have proper intelligence, so that the activities in foreign lands are known, to keep up proper communication with other governments, and so. Now, in some important respects, the reasoning mind is like the government in this analogy. If the people in power are paranoid, then they overestimate the dangers of any given world situation. They overreact or overmobilize, using a disproportionate amount of energy and time for defense and taking energies away from other projects. The reasoning mind acts in the same fashion when paranoid beliefs are in. It therefore tells all of the citizens or cells of the body to mobilize for action, to be on the alert, to pare down all but necessary activities, and so forth. When a government is paranoid, it even begins to cut down on the freedom of its own peoples, or to frown upon behavior that in freer times would be quite acceptable. The same applies to the conscious mind in that situation. Now the people might finally revolt, or they would take certain steps to see that their freedom is restored, and so the body's cells will do the same. So what we want, obviously, is to ensure that the conscious mind, with its reasoning processes, can make proper adjustments about the nature of the world and the individual citizens within it. I will return later to the purposes of man's conscious mind in nature, and part of that discussion will fall in our book. Man's mind is really more of a process. It is not a completed thing like an arm or leg, but a relationship and a process. That process has its source in what I can only call natural reasoning. You are given far more knowledge than you realize when you are born, for example. I am not speaking of genetic information alone, as you understand it, but of a natural yet intuitive reasoning process that is the result of the relationships that exist among all portions of the body. This is the kind of reasoning that is the source from which thinking emerges, and you might think of it as magical reasoning. Each creature is born trusting. There is no such thing as a killer instinct, with the implications and meaning that man gives that term. at levels almost impossible to describe to you in your adulthoods. All infants, for example, know that they are born into the environmental niches that suit them and no others that are tailored to their requirements. You can usually see in a superficial fashion how animals under natural conditions fit into their environments so perfectly, so that their needs and desires and equipment meet and merge with the characteristics of the environment. It is not nearly as easy to see that the same applies to man and his mental and physical environment, his town or country or culture. But the infant trusts from the very first moment. You may not consider trust an attribute connected with reasoning, but it is indeed, for it represents the creature's innate understanding of the support with which it has been gifted. The natural person still feels that trust. There are many books written about occult knowledge or magical knowledge. Most of them are filled with distortions, but they are all efforts to uncover man's natural magical reasoning. I will also have more to say on that subject later. Had Rupert gone to a doctor or a faith healer when we began our last group of sessions, and then in a matter of a week or so found himself able again to walk with his table across the kitchen floor, some 13 or 14 steps perhaps, where before 3 were his uncomfortable limit, he might have attributed the improvement to a doctor's treatment or to a faith healer's ability. But he would have been impressed. He would have been impressed also with the greater obvious motion of his feet, the feelings of release in the legs now spreading to the back and shoulders. Those improvements came about in their way magically because he has begun to use and understand this material. So let him be just as impressed, in fact, more impressed, at the body's natural healing processes that will naturally flow and are naturally flowing when he allows himself to trust his life and the support of his own being. Work with the sessions of late, for again, it is your understanding that sets it all into motion. There are changes in the hips occurring and remarkable improvements already in the works. They must be allowed to happen, however, and that takes place as your understanding brings you in greater correspondence with the natural energy that is always your. I bid you a fond, and again magical, good evening. Session 9. The body's reasoning as logic, belief systems. Good evening. There has been one rather remarkable improvement in Rupert's performance, getting to his feet. That is the result of the body's magical reasoning, for the body reasons so quickly, so clearly and concisely, that its deductions, its logic are far too fast for the intellect to follow. The body reasons directly. The body's reasoning transforms itself into action, with nothing to stand between its elegant logic and the logic's brilliant execution. Rupert could not possibly follow all of the manipulations necessary so that the recent improvements could take place. Again, bodily efforts are as magical, as creative, certainly, as the writing of a book or a poem, but Rupert, in the past, trusted his creative abilities as if they were something he had to guard from his physical self. You are both finally making vital strides in understanding as a result of our last sessions in particular, and on Rupert's part because of the changed attitudes he has allowed, and the changed physical habits, the encouragement of motion, the expanded feeling of identity, which now includes the physical body rather than trying to exclude it. The body is not a tool to do your mental bidding. Your body is a mental expression physically materialized. More improvements are indeed even now occurring. And as long as Rupert's attitude continues to improve, you can expect such progress. For again, the body is quite capable of healing itself completely, and with far greater ease than you give it credit for. Rupert did not have to do anything in particular, for example, of a conscious nature, except to state his intentions, and the body's healing mechanisms immediately quickened. This is because he began to take the pressure off, so to speak, and really began to understand the abilities and limitations of the rational mind in its relationship to the body. You both believed it was quite possible to have clairvoyant dreams, out-of-body experiences, creative adventures in the arts, but to some extent both of you doubted that the same power or energy could be directed effectively in the physical realm, so-called of bodily health, or situations of the nitty-gritty. Again, the material is indeed dealing with a far more valid explanation for the working ways of reality than the old official beliefs, and again, we are not just dealing with evocative, creative hypotheses. There is no need, then, to be surprised if some of our ideas frighten Prentice Hall. If our ideas were already accepted in the world, there would be no need for our work. Prentice Hall is, of course, well-intentioned, and under their belief system, it is nearly sacrilegious to be anything more than officially disapproving of medical matters. That is, some disapproval is acceptable. To attack medical corruption or medical errors or particular clinics, for example, is within bounds, but to attack the belief system of the entire structure is something else again. Their objections should simply show you why our work is so important. You must not forget, again, that you both chose these challenges. You wanted to be involved with the initiation of new thematic material. You wanted the experience of getting it for yourselves, so to speak, the exhilaration of discovery. As a matter of fact, I did indeed temper many of my remarks in mass events on several subjects, so that the book would not be found too objectionable in the context of your times. The implications are there, but your belief systems must be allowed to mellow and change in the light of new knowledge, rather than to be booted aside with an angry foot. End of session. Session 10. Education and Culture, the Natural Person. Rupert's body is repairing itself now at an excellent rate. It is doing so because Rupert is giving it different orders. He is giving it a different picture of the world, and he is doing that because he has finally changed many of his old beliefs. In actuality, the body's response to such information is always instantaneous, whether or not the results show at once. Rupert is beginning to hold a more realistic picture of how overall reality works. He is managing to disentangle himself from many disadvantageous cultural beliefs that both of you for years, like other people, took for granted. You might combat those beliefs, struggle against them, but they still carried great weight. You still believed them to an important degree. The entire idea or fear that Rupert had at one time of leading other people down the garden path was based upon those old beliefs. Those ideas have vanished. You are approaching a state of mind, individually and jointly, that represents far more closely one that is natural, with which the natural person is innately equipped. Education in your culture is a mixed bag, and education comes not from schools alone, but from newspapers and television, magazines and books, from art and from culture's own feedback. Generally speaking, for the purposes of this discussion, there are two kinds of education. One focused toward teaching the child to deal with the natural world, and one focused toward teaching the child how to deal with the cultural world. Obviously, these are usually combined. It is impossible to separate them. Your educational systems, however, for all of their idealism, have largely ended up smothering the natural individual bents and leanings of children and overemphasized instead the cultural organization. It became more important, then, for the child to conform to the culture rather than to follow its own individual natural leanings. Its own characteristic ways of dealing with nature were frowned upon, so that education does not work with the child's abilities, but again, education then often goes against the grain of the natural person. This does not mean that some children do not do very well under your system. I do not mean to imply either that children do not need an education or that some discipline and direction are not beneficial. Children, however, will concentrate for hours at a time on subject matters and questions that interest them. They are often taken from such pursuits, and their natural habits of concentration suffer as a result. You are unlearning right now and discovering that this particular unlearning process is indeed highly educational. You are encountering your own natural knowledge. In many instances, of course, you learned too well, both of you. The natural person that is yourself loved to draw and paint. You did that apart from what you had to do in school as a boy. You were lucky in your relationship with Miss Bowman. Your talent brought you into correspondence with her. You can trust your natural inclinations. These sessions, in that regard, came naturally as the expression of natural abilities and tendencies finally emerging despite your official views at the time. The sessions brought about, however, a new kind of education that often seemed in direct conflict with the old and with the official views of contemporary society. It was, of course, necessary for you to test them out. Rupert felt himself more responsible than you since he spoke the words for me. A private search was one thing, but one publicly followed was something else intently. Whether or not the sessions happened as they did, however, once the two of you met, the probability brought about by your relationship meant that in one way or another you would seek out a larger context of consciousness, a context, because of your talents, that would not remain but attract others. The natural person is to be found. Now, not in the past or in the present, but beneath layers and layers of official beliefs. So you are dealing with an archaeology of beliefs to find the person who creates beliefs to begin with. As I have said often, evidence of clairvoyance, telepathy, or whatever are not eccentric, isolated instances occurring in man's experience, but are representative of natural patterns of everyday behavior that become invisible in your world because of the official picture of behavior and reality. The body's natural healing processes each day rid people of diseases, repair emotional or bodily illnesses, and such instances go largely unrecorded. Rupert accepted the magic of a poem, but not the magic of health or mobility, because he was convinced that mobility stood in the way of his other abilities. He was also convinced, as you were, that you both needed protection from the world. Many of the ideas I have given you lately were indeed in mass events, as Jane remarked today, but they have become alive now. In the same way, many other concepts and ideas already given will also assume a new significance and meaning and add to the richness of your experience, because you will be open to them more than you were before. Rupert, in particular, to ideas having to do with reincarnation, life after death, other spheres of activity. Rupert instinctively likes your tree painting. It represents a certain state of consciousness, moss, an in-between threshold dimension of awareness in which the imagination and the senses are almost caught in the act of putting an object together or of bringing the world into a sensed reality brand new from the realm of the inner mind, a very evocative state of consciousness, and one that, as I believe Rupert mentioned, you could also use in connection with faces. Rupert's body is then magically and naturally repairing itself in a function just as creative, of course, as the inner work that goes on in the production of a book or a poem, a fact he is finally getting through his head when your proofreading is over and Rupert's recovery even more fully demonstrable. We will return to a book session a week and continue this series the other weekly session. We can also expect some improvement in vision, as that area is now being worked on. I bid you a fond good evening. Session 11. Multidimensional Spiritual Dramas. Good evening. Christ was not crucified, therefore he did not resurrect, coming out of the tomb, nor did he then ascend into heaven. In the terms of the biblical drama, however, Christ was crucified. He arose from the tomb and ascended into heaven. The resurrection and the ascension are indeed, however, the two parts of one dramatic event. Dogmatically, a rising from the dead alone was clearly not sufficient, for men were to follow where Christ led. You could not have a world in which the newly risen dead mixed with the living. An existence in a spiritual realm had to follow such a resurrection. Now, in the facts of history, there was no crucifixion, resurrection, or ascension. In the terms of history, there was no biblical Christ, whose life followed the details given. The organization of the church is a historical fact. The power, devotion, and energy, the organizational expertise of Christianity cannot be disputed. Nor can it be disputed that Christianity was based upon great religious and psychic vision. To some extent, it involved the intuitional reorganization of subjective and then objective realities. I have told you, however, that the world of events springs from the world of ideas. It seems certain that something happened back then, and that if you could go back there, invisibly studying the century, you would discover the birth of Christianity. But Christianity was not born at that time. You might say that the labor pains were happening then, but the birth itself did not emerge for some time later. Jewish shepherds represented the placenta that was meant to be discarded, for it was Jewish tradition that nourished the new religion in its early stages before its birth. Christ, as you know, was a common name. So when I say that there was a man named Christ involved in those events, I do not mean to say that he was the biblical Christ. His life was one of those lives that were finally used to compose the composite image of the biblical Christ. The mass psyche was seeking for a change, an impetus, a flowering, a new organization. The idea of a redeemer was hardly new, but ancient in many traditions. As I stated before, that part of the world was filled with would-be messiahs, self-proclaimed prophets, and so forth. And in those terms, it was only a matter of time before man's great spiritual and psychic desires illuminated and filled up that psychological landscape, filling the prepared psychological patterns with a new urgency and intent. There were many throwaway messiahs, men whose circumstances, characteristics, and abilities were almost the ones needed, who almost filled the psychic bill but who were unfitted for other reasons. They were of the wrong race, or their timing was off. Their intersection with space and time did not mesh with the requirements. You must understand the long trail of psychological reality that exists before you have a physical event. You must understand man's need and capacity for fulfillment, dramatization, and psychic creativity. There is nothing that happened in those times that is not happening now in your own. You have numberless gurus, people who seemingly perform miracles, some do. So there were in those days some rather disconnected events that served as the focus point for great psychic activity. People wanted to believe, and their belief changed the course of history. It doesn't matter that the events never happened, the belief happened, and the belief was man's response to intuitional knowledge, to inner knowing, and to spiritual comprehension. These all had to flow into reality, into psychological patterns through man's own understanding. They had to flow into the events of history as he experienced history. They had to touch the times, and they did so by transforming those times for later generations. I want it understood that the accomplishment is breathtaking in its grandeur, more so because man formed from his psyche such a multi-dimensional spiritual drama that its light struck upon this or that person, this or that place, and formed a story more powerful than any physical event could be, hence its power. In those terms, however, again, the gods of Olympus were as real, for all of men's riches are representations, psychic dramatizations, standing for an inner reality that cannot be literally expressed or described, but can be creatively expressed or Two literal translations of such material often led to grief, and the creative thrust becomes lost. The great mystery, of course, and great questions rest in the nature of that inner reality from which man weans his religions, and in the power of the creative abilities themselves that bring them into birth. Such activities on a large scale are the end result of each natural person's individual relationship with nature and with nature's source. I bid you a fond good evening. Session 12. Inserting new ideas into the world. Good evening. I have a few pithy comments. I would like to give you some insight as to why Prentice Hall is our publisher to begin with. Maybe we can, in that way, clear up a matter that often seems to contain some mystery. One said, the explanation will certainly seem obvious. Prentice Hall, in capsule form so to speak, is a representative of the most diverse kinds of thought currently held in your country. That is, under its overall auspices, you have the most conventional establishment-oriented textbooks devoted to continuing traditional ideas. You have there a concentration upon education as it is understood at that level. Under Prentice's auspices, however, you also have Parker books, books that are devoted to quite anti-establishment ideas and concepts, to all brands of psychic, scientific, or religious eccentricities given to matters that contradict the establishment and challenge it at every point. And there, too, you have a concentration upon education in that the books are written to instruct. Our books do not appear under the Parker heading. They are in their way bridges between the two opposing ways of. They are too anti-establishment to be college textbooks, but in their way far too reasonable to be considered eccentricities, in the same fashion now that the Parker books are. Our books are in the regular trade department. This poses some problems for the legal department, which is given to the most literal translation of reality as interpreted through law. You have almost what you could call a schizophrenic relationship existing, say, between Parker books and Prentice's trade book division. The textbook division represents the workings of the intellect in the usual terms of rational thought, and in those books the qualities of the imagination, of the psyche, of poetry, of creativity are quite lacking. Such qualities are indeed considered threats, for they do not accept easy answers and are not content with the status quo. Many of the Parker books, on the other hand, emphasize creativity, the intuitions, the use of the imagination, but are relatively innocent of any clear reasoning, logic, or any feeling for tradition. I am simplifying here to some extent to make my point. Prentice is always, then, to some extent in a state of creative tension as the seemingly opposed, seemingly contradictory elements are each expressed through these two divisions. Because of those divisions, however, there is indeed a great publishing leeway possible of books that otherwise could not mingle. Prentice does more than it knows it does. As a corporate entity, it also has a conscious and unconscious intent, as do all organizations, because they must mirror the people who belong to them. In its way, Prentice is an educational institution. It tries to fly ahead with avant-garde ideas while at the same time protecting its flank of college textbooks. It does not know if our work is fact or fiction in the deepest of terms. It knows the work is not forged. It knows that I appear in sessions, for example, but it does not know whether or not my ideas correspond with a greater reality, or whether they are the result of an extraordinary psychological creativity. Those same characteristics I have mentioned as applying to Prentice apply in their way to Tam, of course. He can indeed express great enthusiasm over work that is highly intuitional, while on the other hand, he has a great respect, in his own way, for established learning and education. Now with the various people at Prentice, you will have such tendencies often appearing separately, so that one person will be highly conventional and dislike changes, while another might be responsive to work that was emotionally exciting, avant-garde. The publishing house. That publishing house represents in capsule form the extremes of thought of your time, from the most conventional to the most bizarre. It therefore represents the public's ideas in their great variety. The legal department knows how to deal with the Parker books. It knows how to deal with fiction. It knows how to deal with conventional textbooks, but in a fashion our books combine all of those elements and transcend them. If Prentice were as conventional at heart as its legal department, it would not publish books at all, except perhaps for the textbooks. Our books are attempting to insert new ideas into the world as it now is, by combining the powers of the intellect and the powers of the intuitions. In other words, by closing the two ends of Prentice's extremes. We have been dealing with the magical approach, and let me gently remind the two of you that I said that you must be willing to change all the way from the old system of orientation to the new, if you want the new approach to work fully for you in your lives. That will, as it happens, include your approach to Prentice, of course. As I said before, also, when faced with the difficulty, the conventional, rational approach tells you to look at the problem, examine it thoroughly, project it into the future, and imagine its dire consequences. And so, faced with the idea of a disclaimer for mass events, that is what you did to some extent, the two of you. You saw the disclaimer as fact, imagined it in your minds on the pages of our books, projected all of that onto future books. And for fine good measure, you both imagined this famous disclaimer published in editions of all the books as well. That is an excellent example of what not to do. Indeed, you both began to pull out of that yourselves. You did at least question the approach. In the meantime, of course, your nervous systems reacted to the implied threat against your work, a threat that now existed in the past, present, and future. You are protected. Your work is protected. When you realized that you act out of confidence, you did indeed catch yourselves. Rupert mentioned those concerns, but not with the same kind of feelings that he would have, say, last Saturday. And when you realize that you are protected, your own intellects can be reassured enough through experience so that they do not feel the need to solve problems with the rational approach in instances where that approach is not feasible. In the deepest of terms, it was not reasonable to merely assume that a disclaimer, if used, would therefore be retroactively and then continuously used. It was not a conclusion based upon fact, but a conclusion based upon a reason that applied to one probability only, one series of probable acts, or based upon the probable act of a disclaimer being used to begin with. So again, what we are dealing with is an overall lesson in the way in which the reasoning mind has been taught to react. These are really instances where the intellect has been trained to use only a portion of its abilities, to zoom in on the most pessimistic of any given series of probable actions, and then treat those as if they were fact. And let me add, I covered our flank in the book, but do not forget that you in your ways, and that corporate entity, do indeed share an educational intent. I will, of course, have more to say that will hopefully allow you to use your intellects in a clear fashion to better your performances. You are quite right, again, to say that there are elements in this situation, or in any given situation, impossible for my intellect to know, so the intellect can take that fact into consideration. Otherwise, you expect it to make deductions, while denying it the comfort it should have of knowing that its deductions need not be made on its own knowledge alone, but on the intuition's vast magical bank of information, from which, in larger terms, all of the intellect's information must spring. So I think you are both finally trying to use a new approach in that direction. My heartiest regards, and a fond good evening. Session 13. Rob, using the magical approach, precognition. Good evening. If you had first read the article of which you have been speaking, and then in a semi-dozing state created your idea of a novel replete with the characterization of the mother, then you would say that cause and effect were involved. Science might admit that the novel idea itself was highly creative, an example of the mind at play as it used experience as a creative raw product. But of course, you had your experience before you read the article, and when that kind of thing happens, science then proclaims that the two events are not connected to each other at all, but are instead the result of coincidental patterns. In your terms, whether a minute or 10 minutes, or an hour or 2 hours were involved, you reacted ahead of time to a headline that you had not as yet physically encountered. You reacted creatively, using the precognitive story as a basis for a fictional endeavor. You turned it to art's purposes. Give us a moment. As you lay there, you were aware of the fact just beneath consciousness, usual consciousness, that you had not brought in the paper before your nap, as is your habit, and almost at a dream level you idly wondered what stories it might contain. Your inclusion of the hospital mix-up in the tale was, as you suspected, connected with the medical ideas you've been dealing with of late. And here was an excellent fictional idea, you see, that could, among other things, bring those ideas into prominence. The idea, then, of the novel came from past and future events, though you were to catch up with those future events very quickly. Your mind intuitively organized all of that material and put it together in a completely new fashion. Sometimes when such events occur, the precognitive trigger is not even recognized when it is encountered physically because it happens too far ahead of time. You organize mental and physical events in a creative manner. In this case, a novel was involved because the concept, while strongly involving images, carried a time span that would make narrative necessary. You used the magical approach. You caught yourself in the act of acting naturally, of demonstrating abilities that your society to a large degree does not admit. That same kind of lightning-swift organization goes on within the body itself constantly, as it deals with probable scenarios to which you may or may not end up reacting to. The events themselves discussed in the newspaper article point up the same kind of magical affiliations. The cells of the young men in question were always in communication, and all of those elements needed to bring about such a reunion took place at that magical level of activity. Consciously, intellectually, the boys had no idea they were triplets. You live personally in a world of lush creative ideas. Your intellect is aware of that. It is used to working creatively. The focused intellect can indeed activate the intuitive abilities, and the healing abilities. You get what you concentrate upon. The intellect is a vital organizer even if it is not aware of the magical levels of activity from which often its best ideas emerge. This will be a very brief session. When you look at world events, however, the present world situation, for example, the war between Iraq and Iran, which began a few days ago, try to enlarge the scope of your intellectual reach so that you consider world events as living multidimensional novels being formed in the present in response to both future and past triggers. The impact of the future on the past, in your terms, or rather the implications of the future on the present, are highly important, and such precognitive reactions are as vital, numerous, and real as you ordinarily think that the reactions to past events are. This puts present world events in an entirely different perspective. Men act, then, in relationship to events that have, historically speaking, not yet occurred, but those events happening, say, in the future, in certain terms cast their shadows back into the present, or illuminate the past according to the event's characteristics. There is always more going on than ordinary sense data show. In your comparatively simple experience, you can see, however, the implications of such activities. Men may react to future events by unconsciously translating them into art or motion pictures. They may react by unconsciously taking certain steps of a political nature that seem at the time either unreasonable or even incomprehensible, steps whose logic appears only in hindsight. The same occurs, of course, in all areas of human behavior, as well as in the behavior of animals and even of plants. This future shadowing the present, or future illuminating the present, represents a vital element in the formation of events as they are perceived in time. In a fashion, the triplets were reacting in their past to a future event that has now caught up with them, so that each of their actions in any moment of that past happened as a result of attention a creative tension between the event of their original separation and the event of their future reunion. I do not mean that the reunion was inevitable or predestined, but the vigor of that probability, you might say, magnified the original tension. I want Rupert to apply all of this to his own situation, both in terms of creative endeavors and his physical situation, so that he begins to understand that he can start to react in the present to a future recovery. He can see how important periods of letting go are. Your experience happened when you were nearly asleep, but merely relaxed, not worrying, with your intellect in a kind of free flow. You were not hampering it. It was momentarily free of limiting beliefs, and it naturally used and chose to use the magical approach to answer what was a very simple, now forgotten intellectual question. What might be in today's newspaper? The usual answer, or the usual method of obtaining an answer, was at the time inconvenient. You were not about to get up, go outside, and get the paper. So on its own, the intellect pressed the magical approach button, you might say, getting the information the quickest and easiest. It did not give you the bare headline, however, even though that and the story were perceived far too quickly for you to follow. What you were aware of were your own creative reveries in response to that information. Now left alone, the intellect will often solve problems in just such a fashion, when it is allowed to, when you forget what is supposed to be possible and what is not, when you forget that your mind is supposed to be pedestrian and parochial. End of session. Session 14. The self, relaxation and effortlessness. Good evening. It is not true, of course, that before the time of modern psychology man had a concept of himself that dealt with conscious exterior aspects only, although it has been written that until that time man thought of himself as a kind of flat-surfaced self minus, for example, subconscious or unconscious complexity. Instead, previous to psychology's entrance, before psychology mapped the acceptable or forbidden, the dangerous or safe compartments of the self, man used the word soul to include his own entire complexity. The word was large enough to contain man's experience. It was large enough to provide room for conventional and unconventional, bizarre and ordinary states of mind and experience. It was roomy enough to hold images of reality that were physically perceived or psychologically perceived. Now the Church finally placed all of the condemnation of its religious laws against certain psychological and mystical experiences, not because it did not consider them realities, of course, but precisely because it recognized too well the disruptive influence that revelationary experience could have upon a world order that was based upon a uniform dogma. Witches were not considered insane, for example, or deranged, for their psychological beliefs fit in only too well with those of the general populace. They were considered evil instead. The vast range of psychological expression, however, had some kind of framework to contain it. The saint and the sinner each had access to great depths of possible heroism or despair. Psychological reality, for all of the religious dangers placed upon it, was anything but a flat, surfaced experience. It was, in fact, because the Church so believed in the great range of psychological activity possible that it was so dogmatic and tireless in trying to maintain order. Unfortunately, with the development of the scientific era, a development occurred that need not have happened. As I have mentioned before, science's determination to be objective almost immediately brought about a certain artificial shrinking of psychological. What could not be proven in the laboratory was presumed not to exist at all. Anyone who experienced something that could not exist was therefore to some extent or another deluded or deranged. There is no doubt that the accepted dimensions of psychological reality began to shrink precisely at the time that modern psychology began. Modern psychology was an attempt to make man conform to the new scientific worldview. It was an attempt to fit man within the picture of evolution and to manufacture a creature whose very existence was somehow pitted against itself. Evolutionary man, with Darwinian roots, could not be a creature with a soul. It had to have hidden in its psychological roots the bloody remnants of the struggle for survival that now cast it in its uneasy role. There is no doubt that the Church cast the soul in a position of stress, caught as it was between its heavenly source and original sin, but there was a sense of psychological mobility involved, one that saw continued existence after death. The new psychology shut off mobility after death while giving each individual an unsavory primitive past heritage, a heritage genetically carried that led finally only to the grave. Psychological activity was scaled down in between life and death. Then, even while the possibility of any after-death experience was considered the most unreasonable and unintellectual of speculation. Any man might rise, in your democracy, from a poor peasant's son to be the president. Outcasts might become the socially prominent. The unlettered might become highly educated. The idea of achieving greatness, however, was considered highly suspect. The self was kept in bounds. Great passion, or desire or intent, or genius did not fit the picture. Now some peoples would not fit into that mold. They would take what they could from your technology, but in conscious and spontaneous ways they retaliated, and still do, by exaggerating all of those human tendencies that your society has held down so well. If you can have reason without faith, then indeed, for example, you will see that there can be faith without reason. When human experience becomes shrunken in such a fashion, compressed when in a fashion it also explodes at both ends, you might say, you have atrocious acts committed, along with great heroisms, but each are explosive, representing sudden releases of withheld energies but have in other ways been forbidden, and so man's mass psyche expresses itself sometimes like explosive fireworks, simply because the release of pressure is necessary. Even your poor, misguided moral organization is saying in its fashion to the scientifically oriented society, how is faith not then? We'll change your laws with it. We'll turn it into power, political power. What will you say then? We have been laughed at for so long. We will see who laughs now. Fanaticism abounds, of course, because the human tendencies and experiences that have been denied by the mainline society erupt with explosive force, where the tendencies themselves must be accepted as characteristics of human experience. Iran is an example for the world, in explosive capsule form, complete with historical background and a modern political one. Modern psychology does not have a concept of the self to begin to explain such realities. Now, in the world you early formed your own beliefs and strategies. In midlife you were presented with our sessions, or the two of you presented yourselves with them, if you prefer. You recognized the overall vitality of our material, but again, you did not realize that it meant a complete reorientation of your attitudes. You did not realize that you were being presented not merely with an alternate view of reality, but with the closest approximation you could get of what reality was and how it worked and what it meant. I have been very gentle in my treatment of your mores and institutions, for I do not want you to be against your world, but for a more fulfilling one. Toward the end of our present book, Dreams, we will be discussing how our ideas can be applied by the individual in terms of value fulfillment, so that individuals can begin to reclaim those dimensions of experience that are indeed your rightful heritage. For Robert, I want him to remember the idea of effortlessness because, with the best of intentions, he has been trying too hard. I want him to remember that relaxation is one of creativity's greatest champions, not its enemy. He is naturally gifted with the quickness of body and mind. Remind him that it is safe to express his natural rhythms, to remember the natural person. Your most vital inspirations are effortlessly yours. I want you to see how many of your beliefs are the result of the old framework, for in that way you will find yourselves releasing yourselves more and more so that your own strengths come to your support. End of session and a fond good evening. Session 15. The natural person and the natural use of time. Our friend is now feeling somewhat more ambitious of late. A few weeks ago, he could hardly wait to lie down at the appointed times, like it otherwise or no, simply because he was so uncomfortable. Now, things have changed somewhat. The sharp discomfort has gone. A few weeks ago, he barely considered taking 2 steps in the kitchen, much less walking twice the length of the living room, or considering walking after dinner. The fact that he is now thinking of walking after dinner is an obvious advance. His irritability is somewhat natural, but also based on the idea still that when he is laying down that is dead time or useless time in forced inactivity. It would help, of course, if he reminded himself that his creative mind is at work whether or not he is aware of it and regardless of what he is doing, and that such periods have the potential, at least, of accelerating creativity if he allows his intellect to go into a kind of free drive at such times. You might have him become more aware of when he actually becomes tired or uncomfortable, so that he does lay down then. The walking after dinner would be excellent, of course, the idea being, however, that if he became uncomfortable from sitting that he lied on the bed, perhaps before watching television for the evening. One important point, again, is to remember that in any given day his mood is often excellent for many periods of time. He should concentrate his attention upon those periods, rather than concentrating upon the periods when he is blue or upset and berating himself for those reactions. In that way, the good moods become longer, they increase, they become significant. In such ways he will discover what promotes these good moods. Later, I will have some things to say about what I will call the daily hypothesis, for each person has such a daily hypothesis, one that might be quite different for, say, Friday than it is for Monday. You build your daily experience partially by such working hypotheses. To some extent, Rupert's dissatisfaction with laying down after dinner also means that he is learning more about his own natural rhythms, for he does feel accelerated at that time, and by the evening, as this is because many of the beliefs that you have individually and jointly are somewhat relieved in the evening, in that they so often apply to the day's activities when the rest of the world seems to be engaged in the 9-to-5 assembly line world experience. You do not project as many negative ideas upon the evening hours, and the same applies to most people to varying degrees. That is at least one of the reasons why these sessions have been held in the evening, where it was at least not as likely that you would try to invest them with the workaday kind of world values. That is also why it is easier, generally speaking, for Rupert to receive such information in the evening, because you are jointly free of limitations that might hamper you at other times of the day. Not simply that visitors might arrive more usually then, but because you yourselves are less visited by preconceptions of what you are supposed to do in any given hour of the day. The natural, magical flows of your own rhythms are more often broken up in the daytime. This applies to other people as well, because of your ideas of what you should be doing at any given time, or what is socially respectable, proper, upright, even moral in limited terms. You have settled upon a system that seems to be naturally based, the exclusive results of your historic past, one in which your main activities are daytime ones. It seems only natural that early man, for example, carried on all of his main activities in the day, hiding after dark. As a matter of fact, however, early man was a natural night dweller and early developed the uses of fire for illumination, carrying on many activities after dark when many natural predators slept. He also hunted very well in the dark, cleverly using all of his senses with high accuracy, the result of learning processes that are now quite lost. In any case, man was not by any means exclusively a daytime creature, and fires within caves extended activities far into the night. It was agriculture that turned him more into a daytime rhythm, and for some time many beliefs lingered that resulted from earlier nighttime agricultural practices. Many people's natural rhythms then still do incline in those directions, and they are always kept operable as alternate rhythms for the species as a whole. Rupert has some inclinations in that direction, as do many creative people, but these rhythms are often nearly completely overlaid by culturally learned ones. Cultures that were night-oriented appreciated the night in a different fashion, of course, and actually utilized their consciousnesses in ways that are almost nearly forgotten. I believe there are ancient fairy tales and myths still surviving that speak of these underworlds or worlds of darkness, but they do not mean worlds of death, as is usually interpreted. In a fashion, the intellect goes hand in hand with the imagination under such conditions. It is not that man stressed physical data less, but that he put it together differently, that in the darkness he relied upon his inner and outer senses in a more unified fashion. The nightly portions of your personalities have become strangers to you, for as you identify with what you think of as your rational intellect, then you identify it further with the daytime hours, with the objective world that becomes visible in the morning, with the clear-cut physical objects that are then before your view. In those times, however, man identified more with his intuitive self and with his imagination, and these to some extent more than now directed the uses to which he put his intellect. This meant, of course, a language that was in its way more precise than your own, for concepts were routinely expressed that described the vast complexity of subjective as well as objective events. There were myriad relationships, for example, impossible now to describe, between a person and his or her dream selves, and between the dream selves of all the members of the tribe. Particularly in warmer climates, man was naturally nocturnal and did a good deal of his sleeping and dreaming in the daytime. You must remember, of course, that the use of clocks is a fairly recent phenomenon. Men thought in terms of rhythms of the time or of flowing time, not of time in sections that were arbitrary. So as far as creaturehood is concerned, you have adapted to a time environment that you yourselves have formed. Creative people, again, are often aware of those connections, at least at certain levels, and Rupert in particular has always felt that way to some extent. You have largely buried your own natural feelings in that direction. Those are Rupert's designations, not mine. Do you have a question? The sessions from the beginning were based upon the natural flow of Rupert's energy, taking advantage of it in such a fashion. End of session. But those rhythms are also more natural to you than you have suspected. You often have freedoms, then, that you do not use, a 24-hour period that you use quite arbitrarily, one that is already sectioned for you by society, but only if you allow it to be. It can be used in any fashion that you wish. A fond good evening. Session 16. Jane's positive results. Good evening. Rupert's skill is as ancient as man is, and indeed all of your arts, sciences, and cultural achievements are the offshoots of spontaneous mental and biological processes. I choose my words quite carefully at times, because I realize the various interpretations that can be placed upon them. Perhaps the following explanation will express more clearly what I mean. In the first place, as often mentioned lately, the reasoning mind is spontaneously fired. The species contains within itself all of the necessary spontaneous attributes that are necessary to form a civilization. For example, all of your reasoned activities, your governments, societies, arts, religions, and sciences are the physical realization, of course, of inner capacities that are inherent in man's structure. Take your theatre's moving picture dramas. These are the materialization in your time of man's natural acting ability, a characteristic highly important in the behavior of the species. Early man, for example, spontaneously played at acting out the part of other animals. He took the part of a tree, a brook, a rock. Acting became a teaching method, a way of passing on information. Man always possessed all of the knowledge he needed. The task was to make it physically available. People like Rupert translated inner knowledge in many ways, through acting it out, through singing or dancing, through drawing images on cave walls. It was the intellect's job to put such information to practical use, and thus the intuitions and the intellect worked hand in hand. Man dealt then with spontaneous knowing in a more direct fashion. It is very difficult to try to explain the various shadings of psychology that were involved. Early man did act in a more spontaneous manner, more automatically in your terms, but not mindlessly. If you remember the early portions of our latest book, Mass Events, then this information should fall into place, for consciousness emerged from the inside outward. Animals enjoy drama, and in their fashions they play act. It was left to man to translate his inner information with a free hand. He is able to form many different kinds of cultures. For example, he puts his sciences and religions, his languages, together in multitudinous ways. But there must always be a translation of inner information outward to the world of sense. There still is. Man's capacities have not dimmed in that regard. Thinking, for example, is as automatic as ever. It is simply that your culture puts the various elements together in ways that stress the qualities of what you refer to as rational thinking. When the species needs certain abilities, they rise to the fore, as in the case of Rupert now. When you are painting pictures, you're also translating inner knowledge. Early artists drew pictures to share the images they saw in their dreams. In a fashion, they practiced dreaming in their sleep, and thus learned also to think in terms of the measurement of physical images and to move objects around in their minds before they did so physically. Poetry was an art and a science. It conveyed quite necessary information about man and the universe. The same can be said of many cave drawings. What you still have, though you are not nearly as aware of it, was an excellent give and take between the inner and outer senses. Through chanting, dancing, play acting, painting, storytelling, man spontaneously translated inner sense data into physical actualization. The physical senses only present you with clues as to your own sensitivities. Rupert translates what I give him without being consciously aware of receiving the material in usual terms or of translating it. It has to be broken down, particularly to a time frame, and then into concepts that can take advantage of the worldview that is held in your culture. Everything must be slanted to fit the viewpoint of creatures who believe most firmly in the superiority of matter over mind, who are immersed in a particular biological framework. I cannot ignore those belief structures, or what I say would literally be incomprehensible. All of this is automatically taken care of. The species has multitudinous abilities, each necessary, each adding to the entire fulfillment and attributes of your people. Some individuals choose to specialize, following specific lines of abilities throughout many existences. Accommodating these, however, to the times in which they are born, both of you have been speakers in that regard. The methods may change. You may speak through art or music, through trance activities, but you will specialize in the use of the inner senses and in translating the inner knowledge of the species, bringing it to whatever level of ordinary consciousness that is considered the official one. You know what sound is, yet as Rupert knows, what you consider sound is only one of sound's many spectrums. Beside translating inner images into paintings, for example, you may unknowingly be translating essentially invisible sounds into images in a way quite impossible to describe. It would be true to say that our sessions actually translate multidimensional images into words. You have no words for the kinds of images I am speaking of, for they are not objects, nor pictures of objects, nor images of images, but instead the inner dimensions, each separate and glowing, but connected prisms of knowledge that have within themselves more reality than you can presently begin to imagine. To a certain extent, I must travel from those realities into your comprehension, wrest myself free in order to form an ever-changing, ever-moving, ever-on-the-move entity that can speak here and be there at the same time. So I am distant and close at once. That distance from you also represents the reaches, however, of the human psyche and the vast corridors of psychological activity from which it is formed and from which your world emerges. For the worlds are so composed that each one is a part of each other one, and there is no disconnecting. There is no place or space, psychological, psychic, where those worlds exist apart from each other, so you cannot say that one is more highly evolved than another. There are as many frontiers as there ever were, and there is no catastrophe that will annihilate consciousness or put an end to earthly life. When you think in terms of Earth's destruction or the ending of the world, you are thinking, of course, of a continuum of time and of beginnings and endings. From your viewpoint in space and time, it seems that planets have come and gone, stars collapsed, and when you look outward into space, it appears that you look backward into time. There are great pulsations, however, in existence, pulsations that have nothing to do with time as you understand it, but with intensities. In the deepest of terms, the world always was and always will be. It changes its patterns of activity, it comes and goes, but it is always itself in its comings and goes. To me, that is exceedingly simple, but as far as your concepts are concerned, it can seem to imply irreconcilable complication. End of session. A small note to our friend to trust the great power of the universe that forms his own image, to trust his spontaneity, and his body's natural urges toward relaxation, motion, and creativity as these show themselves in their own rhythms.